My father abandoned me for his new family. Now he wants me to save the daughter he chose over me. Hello, read it. I spent my entire childhood waiting for a man who never came back. I used to sit by the window, watching cars pass by, imagining that one day he would pull up, step out, and walk through the front door as if nothing had happened. I convinced myself that maybe he had a good reason for leaving, that maybe something had forced him away, that one day he would return and tell me it was all a mistake. But the years passed and reality settled in. He wasn't coming back. He had walked away, and I was nothing more than a forgotten piece of a life he had discarded. I am Rachel, 28 years old, and I have not seen my father since I was 10. Not because I chose to cut him off, not because I pushed him away, but because he never looked back. I remember the day he left like it was burned into my skin, a wound that never quite healed. My parents had been arguing for months, whispers at first, then louder fights that crept through the walls late at night. I didn't understand it then, not really. I just knew that my mother cried more often and that my father stopped looking at me the way he used to. I wanted to believe it had nothing to do with me, but when he packed his bags and walked out that door without saying goodbye, it was impossible not to take it personally. One day he was there, and the next he wasn't. And just like that, I became the child of a man who had chosen someone else. The first few months were the hardest. I still set an extra plate at the table, still ran to the door every time I heard footsteps outside. I still looked for him in crowds, convinced that if I just found the right words, if I just showed him how much I missed him, he would come back. But he never did. Instead, I got silence. No phone calls, no letters, no visits. Just a gaping absence where a father should have been. I asked my mother once why he didn't call, why he didn't want to see me, and the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know before she even answered. He had moved on. He had built a new life. He had a new wife, and eventually a new child. And there was no room for me in that picture. I stopped asking about him after that. I learned to swallow the lump in my throat when other kids talked about their dads picking them up from school. I learned to stop hoping, stop waiting, stop wondering. By the time I reached high school, I had turned my longing into resentment, my grief into anger. I didn't need him. I had survived without him, built a life without him, and I refused to let the ghost of a man who had abandoned me take up space in my head any longer. But no matter how much I tried to bury it, the past had a way of creeping back in. I heard his name again for the first time in years at a family dinner. It was one of those obligations I couldn't escape, the kind where I sat through forced conversations with relatives who barely knew me, answering questions about my job and my plans for the future while they exchanged knowing glances about why I still wasn't married. I had tuned most of it out, focusing on pushing food around my plate, until I heard them whispering. It was the way they spoke that caught my attention. Low voices, hushed tones, the kind of conversation that wasn't meant for my ears. At first, I thought it was just another piece of family gossip, something trivial, something meaningless. But then, I heard my father's name. It was strange, hearing it after so many years. It felt foreign, distant, like the name of someone I used to know, but had long since forgotten. For a moment, I thought I had misheard, but then my aunt sighed, shaking her head, and said something about how unfair it all was. How she was so young. How they had tried everything. And then, my mother's voice, quiet but firm. They just needed me to say yes. A cold feeling spread through me, a slow realization creeping in like a sickness. My father had called. After nearly 2 decades of silence, after years of pretending I didn't exist, he had finally reached out. But not because he missed me, not because he regretted leaving, not because he had spent the last 18 years wondering what had happened to his daughter. No, he had called because he needed something, or rather, because she needed something, the daughter he had actually stayed for, the child he had raised, loved, chosen. My half-sister, a girl I didn't even know existed until that moment, was sick, and I was the best match for a kidney transplant. I sat frozen in my chair, the sounds of the dinner table fading into a dull hum. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as the weight of it all settled on my chest. After all these years, after all the birthdays he had missed, after all the times I cried myself to sleep wondering what was so wrong with me that he had walked away, he had finally found a reason to remember me. And it wasn't love. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't regret. It was need. I was nothing more than spare parts to him. The conversation around me continued, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. My mother sighed, as if this was some unavoidable burden placed upon me, as if it were expected that I would agree. My aunt murmured about how tragic it all was, about how it wasn't fair to punish the child for the father's mistakes. My cousin, who barely knew me, said something about how this was a chance for me to be the bigger person, as if I owed them anything, as if I owed him anything. I gritted my teeth, nausea curling in my stomach as I stared at my mother and my family, at the people who had watched me struggle to grow up without a father and still thought I should be the one to fix the mess he had made. They wanted me to say yes. They wanted me to be selfless, to be forgiving, to be the daughter he had never deserved. But all I could think about was the 10-year-old girl who had waited by the window for a father who never came. The teenage girl who had learned to stop hoping. The woman who had built a life without him, who had fought through every painful memory, every wound, and come out the other side stronger. I owed him nothing. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back, my appetite long gone. The room fell silent, every pair of eyes now on me, waiting for my answer. They wanted me to say yes. They wanted me to be kind, to be understanding, to be the family he had thrown away. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I had spent my whole life waiting for my father to show up for me. Now, it was his turn to wait. I walked out of that dinner feeling lighter, but not in a way that brought relief. It was the kind of weightlessness that came from standing too close to the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong step could send me spiraling. The air outside was cold, but I barely felt it as I made my way to my car, my mother's voice still ringing in my ears, the quiet disappointment, the expectation that I would eventually come around. They all thought they knew me, that I was just angry, that given enough time, I would soften. But they were wrong. I drove home with my thoughts tangled in knots, my grip tight around the steering wheel as I tried to process the fact that my father was alive, that he had another daughter, that she was dying, and that somehow, all these years later, I was supposed to be the one to save her. I could still see my family's faces at the table, the pity, the judgment, the way they had already decided the kind of person I should be. No one had asked me how I felt. No one had even considered that I might not want to meet him, that I might not want to carve out space for a man who had made it so clear that I didn't belong in his life. To them, this was simple. It wasn't about me. It was about an innocent girl who had nothing to do with the past. A girl who was sick. A girl who needed me. But where had they been when I needed someone? Where had they been when I was the girl, crying in my room, feeling like I had been erased from my own father's life? No one had rushed to my side then. No one had pleaded with him to remember me. No one had fought for me. I pulled into my driveway, turning off the engine but not moving, staring at my reflection in the dark window. My face looked different somehow, like I was seeing myself for the first time. Maybe it was the anger. Maybe it was the realization that no matter how much I tried to move on, my father's absence had always been there, a ghost lingering in the corners of my life, waiting for the right moment to haunt me. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, but eventually my phone buzzed. A new number. I already knew who it was before I even read the message. It was him. For the first time in 18 years, my father had reached out. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, my fingers frozen. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete the message without reading it, to pretend like he was still a ghost. But I couldn't. My curiosity, my anger, my need to understand why he thought he could reach out after all this time. It was too strong. I opened the message. It was short, almost careful, as if he wasn't sure what to say. He wanted to meet. He wanted to talk. I locked my phone and threw it onto the passenger seat, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My whole life, I had imagined this moment, what I would say if I ever saw him again. I had thought about screaming at him, demanding answers, making him feel even a fraction of the pain he had caused me. But now that it was real, now that he was reaching out, I didn't know what to do. I told myself I wouldn't respond. I told myself that he wasn't worth my time. But that night, long after I'd gone to bed, my thoughts refused to let me sleep. I kept seeing that message, hearing his voice in my head, even though I barely remembered what it sounded like. I wasn't a little girl anymore, waiting for him to come back. But that didn't mean the questions had disappeared. And if this was my only chance to get the truth, to finally understand why he had chosen to leave me behind, maybe I needed to take it. Not for him, not for his dying daughter, but for me. I agreed to meet him the next day. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell anyone. If they knew, they would try to convince me to forgive him, to be gentle, to give him a chance. But I wasn't meeting him for closure. I was meeting him because after all these years, he had finally come crawling back, and I wanted to see the look in his eyes when he realized that I was no longer the girl he had left behind. The cafe was small, tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place where people went to have intimate conversations, where secrets were shared over cups of coffee. I arrived early, but he was already there, sitting at a table near the window, his fingers wrapped around a mug, his gaze distant. I almost didn't recognize him. His hair was thinner, his face more lined, his shoulders hunched slightly like the weight of his choices had finally begun to crush him. He looked older, but not just in the way that time aged people. He looked like a man who had lost something, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered if that something had been me. But then he saw me, and any trace of sympathy I might have felt disappeared. His eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across his face, and for a moment, I hated him for that. He had expected me to be different, softer, maybe more willing to hear him out. I sat down across from him, arms crossed, waiting. He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully, but I didn't need to hear them. I could already tell what kind of conversation this was going to be. He would tell me he regretted leaving. He would say he had made mistakes. He would ask for my forgiveness. But no matter how carefully he chose his words, no matter how much emotion he tried to force into them, nothing would change the truth. He had abandoned me. And now, after 18 years, he was here, not because he wanted to rebuild a relationship with me, but because he needed something from me. I watched him, waiting, letting the silence stretch between us until it became unbearable. I wanted him to feel it, to sit in it, to understand what it felt like to be left in the dark with no answers. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I remembered, like he wasn't sure if he even had the right to say my name. He told me about his daughter, my half-sister, how she was sick, how the doctors had tried everything, how he had spent the last few months watching her deteriorate. He told me about the transplant list, how time was running out, how I was the only real match. He didn't apologize. Not once. He didn't say he was sorry for leaving me. He didn't say he regretted choosing his new family over me. He didn't ask how I had been, if I was okay, if I had been happy without him. Because none of that mattered to him. The only thing that mattered was that I had something his daughter needed. I should have been angry. I should have stood up and walked away. But instead, I laughed. A quiet, bitter sound because in that moment, everything became so painfully clear. He had never thought about me in all these years. Not once. Not until he had a reason to. And that realization burned deeper than anything else ever had. The laugh that slipped from my lips wasn't planned. It was quiet at first, barely more than a breath. But as the absurdity of the situation settled into my bones, it grew into something sharper, something bitter. My father sat across from me, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Shame, maybe, or the hollow echo of whatever guilt he thought he was supposed to feel. But it wasn't enough. Not even close. He had been speaking, trying to explain, but I wasn't really listening. His words blurred together, just noise filling the space between us, empty syllables from a man who had only remembered I existed because he needed something from me. I had thought that maybe in some twisted way, this would bring me closure, that seeing him again, seeing him desperate, would somehow heal the wound he had left all those years ago. But instead, it only confirmed what I had always feared. I had never mattered to him. Not when he walked away. Not during the birthdays he missed. Not during the years I spent wondering if I had done something wrong, if I had been too much or not enough. And I didn't matter to him now. He wasn't here because he wanted me back in his life. He wasn't here because he regretted leaving. He was here because his other daughter, the one he had chosen, was dying, and I was his last resort. My laughter faded, but the weight of it lingered between us. He stopped talking. He was waiting for me to say something, waiting for me to soften, to lean into the story he was telling. But I wouldn't. I couldn't. I could feel the eyes of the other cafe patrons shifting toward us, subtle glances, quiet curiosity at the tension humming between us. But I didn't care. My world had narrowed to the man sitting across from me, the father I'd spent a lifetime grieving, and the unbearable truth that he had never grieved losing me. I leaned back in my chair, studying him in a way I never had before. His face was older, more worn, but not in the way of a man who had suffered. He looked comfortable, well taken care of, like the years had been kind to him, like he had lived a full life while I had been nothing more than a shadow in his past. I hated him for that. I hated him for every night I had cried myself to sleep as a child, wondering why I wasn't enough. I hated him for the birthdays spent waiting by the phone for a call that never came. I hated him for the way my mother had struggled, working 2 jobs just to keep us afloat while he built a new family, a better family, one that didn't include me. And now, after all that, he expected me to save the child he had stayed for. The irony was almost laughable. I should have left then. I should have stood up and walked out of that cafe, let him sit there with his desperation, let him feel what it was like to wait for someone who wasn't coming. But something held me in place. A thought, sharp and unrelenting. I had spent my whole life wondering why he had left. Now, I had a chance to make him say it. So I let the silence stretch between us until he shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around his coffee mug. I let him squirm under the weight of my stare, let him feel even an ounce of the pain I had carried for years. And then, finally, I asked the question that had haunted me since I was 10 years old. Why? He hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. I had imagined 1,000 different answers over the years. Maybe he had been struggling. Maybe he had been young and afraid. Maybe he had convinced himself that I was better off without him. But the truth, the real truth, was so much worse than any of those things. He didn't answer right away. He looked down at his coffee, exhaled slowly, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost careful. He told me he had loved my mother once, but that their relationship had been broken long before he left. He told me he had met someone else, and that by the time he had realized what he wanted, it was too late. She was already pregnant. His new daughter had already existed before he even left me. I felt something inside me crack, something I hadn't even realized was still whole. All these years, I had assumed that he had walked away because he had fallen out of love with my mother, because he had wanted something different. But the truth was so much colder. He had walked away because he had already started over. He hadn't just abandoned me. He had replaced me. I sat there, my heartbeat hammering in my ears, my nails digging into the fabric of my jeans. I wanted to scream at him, to throw my coffee in his face, to tell him he was the worst kind of man. But I didn't, because I realized something in that moment, something that sent a slow, cruel kind of satisfaction curling through my chest. He wasn't here because he wanted my forgiveness. He was here because his real daughter was dying. And despite everything, despite all the choices he had made, all the times he had ignored my existence, I was the one who could save her. I was his last hope. And that terrified him, because if I said no, his perfect little family would fall apart. For the first time in my life, I had the power, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to use it to save her, or to finally make him feel the kind of helplessness I had felt my entire life. For the first time in my life, I had the power. I sat across from a man who had once been my father, watching the weight of his own choices settle onto his shoulders, watching the years of comfortable denial crumble under the pressure of his own desperation. He had expected this to be easy. He had expected me to be angry, maybe even hurt, but ultimately willing to forgive him. He had thought that blood would be enough, that I would hear his story, understand his regret, and step in to save the daughter he had chosen over me. But he didn't know me. He had never known me. I let the silence stretch between us, watching him squirm. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being the one waiting, the one hoping, the one feeling helpless. He had spent my entire life making decisions that never included me, walking through the world without ever considering how his absence had shaped me. Now, for the first time, he needed something from me, and he was realizing that I wasn't the child he had left behind. I wasn't the little girl who would have given anything just to hear him say he loved me. I was a woman who had lived without him, grown without him, hardened in the places where his absence had left scars. I saw the exact moment he realized that I wasn't going to say yes. His face changed, just slightly, a flicker of something behind his eyes, the faintest twitch of his jaw. It wasn't regret. It wasn't even disappointment. It was fear, because if I said no, his real daughter would die. I stood up without a word, leaving him sitting there, his coffee untouched, his face drawn with something he couldn't name. He didn't try to stop me. Maybe he knew better. Maybe he thought I just needed time. Maybe he still believed, even after everything, that I would come around, that I would be the bigger person, that I would take pity on him, on her, that I would choose kindness. But I wasn't sure if I had kindness left in me. The weight of it all didn't hit me until I was back in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. I had imagined this moment for years, fantasized about what I would say if I ever saw him again. But none of those imagined conversations had ended like this. I had never once considered that I would be given the chance to choose whether he suffered. And yet, here I was. The question clawed at the back of my mind as I drove, creeping into every thought, every breath. Could I live with myself if I let her die? Could I really stand by and do nothing, knowing that I had the power to save her life? I wanted to say yes. I wanted to be the kind of person who could look at this situation and say that it wasn't about him, that it wasn't about the past, that a child shouldn't have to pay for her father's mistakes. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something I hadn't let myself admit before. She wasn't a child. She was 20 years old, an adult, old enough to know who I was, old enough to know that I existed. And yet, in all these years, she had never reached out. She had never tried to find me, never questioned why her father had another daughter that he had abandoned. She had been just as willing to forget about me as he had. I wanted to hate her for that. I wanted to blame her, to make this easier by turning her into the villain. But the truth was, she hadn't taken my father from me. He had made that choice on his own, and now he was paying for it. For the next few days, I waited. I expected my mother to call, to show up at my door, to tell me that I was being cruel, that I was being heartless. But she didn't. Instead, it was my aunt who came first, knocking on my door like she had every right to be here, her expression already twisted with disapproval. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask how I felt. She just told me that I needed to put the past behind me, that I needed to think about my sister, that I couldn't let a young woman die just because of a grudge. I listened, stone-faced, as she lectured me about family, about forgiveness, about doing the right thing. And when she finally finished, I asked her a single question. Where was all this concern when I was the child left behind? She had no answer. Just silence, just an awkward shift of her feet, just a look of discomfort as she realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as righteous as she thought she was. Then came my cousin, then my uncle, then my mother. One by one, they tried. They begged. They guilt. They said all the things I expected them to say. That I was being selfish. That I was being cruel. That I was better than this. And maybe they were right. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I was being cruel. Maybe I should have been better than this. But I didn't know him kindness. I didn't know him forgiveness. I didn't know him anything. And yet, the weight of it lingered. It followed me through every moment of my day, through the grocery store, through work, through the nights where I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I would ever feel okay again. It wasn't about him. It wasn't even about her. It was about me. Could I live with this? Could I let her die knowing that I had been the only person who could save her? I avoided my phone for days, ignoring the missed calls, the unread messages. But then one night, I opened it, scrolling through them mindlessly, letting them blur together into a single, endless plea. And then I saw it. A message from an unknown number. Not from my father. Not from my family. From her. It was short. Just a few words. I don't expect you to forgive him. But please don't punish me for something I didn't do. And for the first time since this all started, I felt something other than anger. Because she was right. She hadn't abandoned me. She hadn't left me behind. She had just been a child, living in the world he had created for her, just like I had once been. But that didn't mean I owed her my kidney. It just meant I had to decide whether or not I could live with being the reason she died. The morning of the surgery felt eerily quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to change my mind. But I wouldn't. I had made my decision, and I wasn't the kind of person who backed out at the last second. I had spent years telling myself that my father's absence didn't define me, that I had built my own life without him, that I had no need for closure. But I had been lying to myself. The moment he had come back, the moment he had forced his way into my world again, I had realized how much weight I was still carrying, how much of my past still clung to me like a second skin. But I wasn't doing this for him. I wasn't even doing it for her. I was doing it because I needed to prove to myself that I was better than he had ever been. The hospital room was cold, too sterile, too impersonal. I had always hated hospitals, the way they smelled like antiseptic and fading hope, the way they made people feel smaller, powerless. But here I was, lying in a bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for them to take something from me. I had read all the pamphlets, all the risks, all the statistics about living with one kidney. I had memorized every potential complication, every worst-case scenario. But none of that scared me. What scared me was knowing that once this was over, once I had done the thing my father begged me to do, there would be nothing left. Nothing tying us together. Nothing left for him to ask of me. And that thought should have brought relief. But all it did was leave an empty space in my chest that I didn't know how to fill. The doctors came in, their voices professional but warm, telling me it was time. I nodded, feeling like I was moving through water, slow and detached, my body carrying me forward even as my mind threatened to pull me back. There was no going back now. I had made my choice. I had set the terms. He wasn't allowed to see me. He wasn't allowed to talk to me. If he tried, if he so much as sent a message, I would walk away, and they would lose their last chance. I had made sure of that. They wheeled me through the corridors, bright lights passing above me in rhythmic flashes. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's life play out on a screen, like I was a spectator in my own story. I didn't think about my father. I didn't think about my family. I didn't even think about the sister I had never met. I thought about myself, about who I was before this moment, and who I would be after. The anesthesia took hold, pulling me under, and for the first time in weeks, I felt nothing at all. When I woke up, everything hurt. It was a slow, creeping pain, dull at first, then sharp when I moved. I groaned, my throat dry, my body sluggish, my mind struggling to piece everything together. For a moment, I forgot where I was, forgot what had happened. But then the weight in my side reminded me. The heaviness, the absence. It was done. I blinked, adjusting to the harsh hospital lighting, my eyes moving to the 4-drip beside me, the quiet beeping of machines. There were flowers on the small table near the window, white lilies, fresh, delicate. No note, just an offering. Not for my father. I knew that much. A nurse came in, smiling, speaking in soft tones, telling me that the surgery had gone well, that my body was adjusting, that I would need time, but that everything had gone as planned. She asked if I wanted to see my family. I almost laughed. What family? My mother hadn't come. My aunt hadn't come. The people who had been so desperate to convince me to go through with this had suddenly vanished the moment it was over. I asked for my phone instead. There were messages, dozens of them, some from my mother, some from my cousin, all saying how proud they were of me, how I had done the right thing, how my father was so grateful. But none of them had bothered to show up. None of them had sat by my bed, held my hand, made sure I was okay. They had wanted the outcome, but not the responsibility. And then, at the very bottom of my inbox, a single message stood out. Not from my father, from her, the girl who had been raised in my place. I don't know if you'll ever want to meet me, and I don't blame you if you don't. But I wanted you to know that I've thought about you my whole life. I always knew something was missing. I just didn't know it was you. I read the message 3 times before I let myself feel anything. She had known about me. Not in detail, not in the way I had known about her, but she had known. And she had never reached out, not because she didn't care, but because our father had made sure of it. I wondered how much of her life had been shaped by his silence. I wondered if she resented him now, the way I had for so many years. I didn't reply. Not then. I healed slowly. The pain lingered for weeks, my body adjusting to the loss, to the new balance. I moved through the days in a fog, going back to work, going through the motions, pretending like this had just been a minor inconvenience, like it hadn't changed something inside me. My father never reached out. Not once. Not even to say thank you. I had saved his daughter's life, and to him, that was the end of it. I had served my purpose. That should have broken me, but instead it set me free. I had spent my whole life waiting for him to acknowledge me, waiting for some grand gesture, some apology that would make up for everything he had done. But there was no apology coming. There never had been. And for the first time, I understood that I didn't need it. I had given him nothing. Not my forgiveness, not my love, not my presence. All I had given was a kidney, and that was something he could never repay. Months passed. I didn't think about him much anymore. But one day, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address. No markings except my name, written in small, careful handwriting. I opened it, my breath catching when I saw what was inside. A letter. From her. It was long, spanning pages, each one filled with words that I hadn't expected. She told me about her life, about the things our father had never told her, about the questions she had always had but had been too afraid to ask. She told me she wasn't reaching out to force a relationship, that she understood if I never wanted to see her again. But she wanted me to know that she wasn't like him, that she wouldn't forget me, that she didn't want to be like him. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the words, at the weight of what she was offering. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel alone. And that was enough.